I was recently invited to join a group meditation on what sounded like a very swanky boat off of the island of Manhattan. And it was all sponsored by Lululemon. Now, my first reaction was, wow, that's amazing. Meditation has come a long way. I mean, it used to be this kind of fringe, new agey practice, and now it has a mainstream corporate sponsor. It's impressive. My second reaction was a little bit more negative, and that was, get me the hell away from that. In fact, get me as far away from anything like that as humanly possible. Why? Well, because, ladies and gentlemen, for 8 years, I was in a cult. And 3 years ago, that cult fell apart. And I'm going to tell you that story in a second. But before I do, I want to share with you my third reaction, because that's the one I'm still wrestling with today. And that was, is this the best that we can do? I mean, for people who have left traditional religions behind, who have embraced values of science and secularism, and yet who still hunger and thirst for deeper spiritual experience and meaning, is our only matter of recourse to, say, read a couple of Eckhart Tolle books and then go meditate on a boat? Or is it possible to, as a society, value science and secularism and the wholehearted pursuit of spiritual inquiry and growth? Which is to say, can we be both radically rational and radically open-minded? Now, if we're going to be radically rational, we probably ought to at least define our terms to some degree, and the most problematic term here, of course, is spirituality. It's confusing. It's vague. It means a million different things to different people. And yet, I don't think there's a better word to describe the type of philosophical and experiential terrain that we're talking about here. So, for better or for worse, we'll use it. Now, I think that you can broadly break down spirituality into two domains. And to be sure, this is an overgeneralization, but I think for the purposes of this talk, a useful one. The first domain of spirituality is what you might call the worldly domain. And that really has to do with how good are you? How kind are you? How much do you act in the service of others? And I think, or at least I would hope, that we would all agree that we can't have enough of that kind of spirituality in our world today. The second domain is definitely more esoteric, maybe even a little bit weird to some, but no less powerful in what I want to focus on in this talk. And that's what's typically described as the mystical or transcendent experience. Now, Pew estimates that nearly half of all Americans, that's about 150 million people, have had a powerful mystical or spiritual experience. But just in case, I don't want to assume, and so I want to put you inside of one that I had when I was 19 years old. So, imagine that you're hanging out with a friend, sitting at the kitchen table, not talking about anything in particular, food, sports, movies. And suddenly, completely out of nowhere, all sense of separation vanishes. I mean, you see that there is another person there, but you don't experience yourself as in any way separate from that person. In fact, the you that you're used to being with all of your confining and limiting ideas and beliefs and your suffocating neuroses and impulses and compulsions, it's nowhere to be found. And you're swimming in this sea of joy and bliss and ecstasy, and you literally feel one with everything. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, that's a very powerful and positive experience to have, and one we might even want to encourage more and more people to have in our world today. But I fear that as we become more secularized, we're at risk of losing touch with that kind of depth. And make no mistake, we are becoming more secularized. Pew also found that my generation, the millennial generation, is the most secular in American history. And yet, several years ago, UCLA did a study that found that 80% of millennials are interested in spirituality. And so the hunger is absolutely there. And what many in my generation have done is replace their traditional sources of spirituality, the church, the synagogue, the temple, the mosque, with groups like SoulCycle and CrossFit and veganism and social entrepreneurship. And while many of those things are wonderful, they simply don't accomplish the cultivation of the type of depth that we're talking about here. For that, you've typically needed a more formal environment like a monastery or an ashram. And so, absent of that more formal environment, is it possible today to create a spiritual path that satisfies even the most skeptical and secular among us? I think it could be, but before we get there, I want to tell you my own story as a kind of cautionary tale. Because for as positive as these types of experiences can be, they can also be so uprooting and disorienting that they can lead us to confusing and even dangerous places. Okay, so I joined a cult. Why? Well, if you were to look to popular depictions in Hollywood, you would have to assume that I came from a broken home or was acting out of total psychological desperation. Well, I'm sorry to say that I had a wonderful and loving childhood with two great parents. Thank you, Mom and Dad. They're here today. And I was simply a curious and idealistic young guy. And that curiosity and that idealism led me to a talk about creating a better future on a sunny day in late June of 2003 in New York City. I was 23 years old. And one of the speakers' names was Andrew Cohen, and he led a group called Enlighten Next. Now, as it happens, I had actually met Andrew about a year earlier, and he immediately struck me like a cult leader. I actually vowed to myself never to get involved with him or his organization. And yet, here I was at a talk. He was speaking. I was in the audience. He talked. I listened. 90 minutes went by, and it was time for a break. And that is when everything changed. The second I walked outside, New York was no longer New York. The colors were brilliant. They were beautiful. They were almost blinding. Time slowed down. The hustle and bustle and chaos of the city with all of its cab horns and commuters and crowds and shouts and shoves, none of it was stressful. It was all this glorious, creative unfolding that I was deeply a part of and connected to and even an expression of. Less than 3 years later, I was living on a compound with Andrew as his devotee on a property called Fox Hollow in rural Massachusetts, and I'm a city guy. Now, life at Fox Hollow was, in a word, intense. Every day we were on the edge of something, a new insight, a collective breakthrough, and for me, more often than not, a personal breakdown. We went to extremes to pursue spiritual growth. I, brace yourselves, was celibate for 6 years. For six years, I had sex with no one, including yours truly. We did thousands of prostrations. What's a prostration, you ask? Well, let me show you. It looks like this. To be free means to have nothing. To be free means to know nothing. To be free means to be no one. Now, though extreme, a lot of those practices produced insights and experiences that were incredibly freeing. And yet, paradoxically, the deeper in I and pretty much we all got, the less free we became. Nearly every aspect of our lives was controlled or influenced by some way by Andrew and his community. Our schedules, our diets, who we dated. 2 friends of mine had to have a secret love affair because they didn't have permission to see each other. Every single day, in any given moment, you were walking on eggshells. You were either a shining star or a pariah, riding high on the love and admiration of others, or completely cut off from it, an insider or an outcast. You were never quite sure if you were going to make a colossal mistake, become a hero, or, at worst, be deemed a total spiritual failure as a human being. And that traumatized a lot of people very deeply over the years. And so, if that all sounds like it was a bit too much, you're right, it was. 3 years ago, a group in Andrew's inner circle challenged him to give up that control, to let go of power. And he couldn't, or he wouldn't. And so, over the course of about a month, everything fell apart. Andrew stepped down, we all left, our entire community unraveled. Now, it would be so much easier for me if I could just stand up here and tell you the whole thing was a wash, it was all insignificant, chalk it all up to bad judgment and an exercise in futility. But I can't. I can't because so many of the positive experiences that I had are still living with me every day. And so many of the lessons that I learned, both positive and negative, hold relevance for the world that we're living in today. And so, to come back to this question, is it possible to give people those kinds of positive experiences without forcing them to join a cult? I think it could be, but what I am more and more convinced of every single day is that if we're going to create a healthy spirituality for the 21st century, it has to begin with science, with empiricism. You might call it an evidence-based spirituality. Now, what might that look like? How might that be applied? Well, let's start with the spiritual experience itself. Are there empirically valid patterns and properties of the spiritual experience that you can draw across traditions and cultural contexts? And I think the answer to that is yes. At least that's what the early data seem to point to. Andrew Newberg, who pioneered some of the early brainwave studies of Tibetan Buddhist meditators and monks, surveyed 2,000 people, it's a decent number, who had a powerful spiritual experience. And what he found that was, while the contents of their experiences varied wildly, some saw Jesus, others Buddha, some saw a bright white light, others no image or symbol at all, what they all shared were a number of qualities. A sense of unity or connectedness. That should sound familiar. An incredible intensity of experience. People use words like I did. Joy, bliss, ecstasy. a sense of surrender, like something bigger was happening, that they weren't just trying to contrive or orchestrate an experience. The feeling that things suddenly made sense in a whole new way. And this was what led me to Fox Hollow, the sense that everything had suddenly changed. Okay, so if you'll indulge me, maybe we can concede that the spiritual experience can be an empirically valid phenomenon to analyze and not just some weird, dangerous hallucination or illusion. The next question would be, are there people who can help evoke that in us, or at least impart its lessons in a particularly powerful way? In other words, can there be genuine spiritual authorities? And I think the answer to that is also yes, although for this one, my data are entirely anecdotal. But there were thousands of people who had experiences similar to mine. And like me, I've talked to many of them, and they've told me that they didn't really understand what Andrew was talking about, and they weren't particularly transfixed by him personally. Or take an example from the famous neuroscientist and atheist, Sam Harris. Now, as it happens, Sam actually studied with Andrew's same teacher when he was younger, H.W.L. Punja. And what Sam found was that he had more liberating insights in Punja's presence than with any other teacher that he met along the way, despite the fact that he liked those teachers more and liked Punja less and found Punja to be morally and ethically dubious. Okay, so maybe you're still with me and we can agree that there is such a thing as a spiritual authority, that not every guru or pastor or preacher is a charlatan or snake oil salesman or con artist. How much authority should they have? Do they have special insight into what it means to live a moral and ethical life? And should they be granted special license to tell us how to live ours? And there, the answer is, I believe, categorically no. I mean, if I had $1 for every time a guru, preacher, pastor, rabbi, or spiritual authority of any kind fell from grace, was revealed to be doing the exact opposite of what they were preaching, I wouldn't be a billionaire, but I would absolutely be able to take an all-expenses-paid vacation to a very nice tropical island. And so while I do think there may be a role for the spiritual authority in an evidence-based approach, I think that has to be limited to cultivating this kind of insight. And that has to do with what I call the people are totally awesome and they also kind of suck theory of humanity, which holds that on one hand, people are totally awesome. I mean, isn't it incredible that we could all develop depth in such an amazing insight and experience? And at the same time, we kind of suck. I mean, none of us is immune to the basest of human impulses, to fear, to lust, to greed, to avarice, to Machiavellianism. And so if we don't take this evidence-based approach, we're going to be living our lives according to the whims of an individual who's as flawed as the rest of us, or those same flawed individuals interpreting texts that are thousands of years old and certainly weren't built for the world that we're living in today with all of our social complexity and scientific advancement. Okay, so maybe you're with me, maybe you agree that an evidence-based approach to spirituality could help us avoid some of the pitfalls of religious and cultic contexts and steer us in a more positive direction. How do we get there? And how do we get there together? Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the question to which I have no answer, and I can't give you your money back. But I do think that if we can get it right, the implications will be about far more than any one individual's personal happiness alone. And that's because if we're able to build a society more and more on the foundation of that core mystical insight, that deeper spiritual truth, that everything is one, and that we are all that one, all of us, and that none of us is separate. None of us, not you, not me, none of us is separate from anyone or anything, anywhere, ever. That could have important social and political consequences too. Now, the group that I was a part of tried, and we failed. But I think that if we can create a healthy spirituality for a secularizing society, ours will be a much better world to live in. Thank you.